And welcome back. International company McKinsey says governments around the world, along with private and social sectors, are once again doubling their efforts to suppress COVID-19 to save lives. While the battle is far from over, there are indications that an increasing number of countries are succeeding in slowing or reversing the infections growth rate. These countries can prepare to transition to a new phase in which physical lockdown restrictions are carefully modified while test, trace and track strategies remain firmly in place. This is what South Africa is doing. Safeguarding and recreating jobs must be critical priorities, though, as countries, regions and cities enter this transition. A sector and occupation level heat map can be a key tool in this effort. We're joined now by Cebile Xulu, who is an HR expert and people lead of Sub-Sahara Africa, Mondelez International. A very good evening to you, and thank you very much for speaking to us. Let's first start with your point of view of where we are as a country. We'll talk about the pay cuts and the layoffs in just a moment, but what would you read as our current situation?
Good evening, Tsepiso, and to the SABC viewers at home. So I think what we are seeing now is the fact that our readiness as a country to migrate to the new normal is not where it should be. If you look at our technological infrastructure, we still have a long way to go, where companies are not yet ready for people to start working from home, for example. We saw this when the lockdown was first announced, that some companies struggled to get their workers running as normal from the time that the lockdown was announced, because from an infrastructure perspective, we are not ready. And then secondly, from just a culture perspective and a mindset shift, we are not where we need to be in terms of understanding that work can be performed anyway. So you don't necessarily need to be sitting in an office to be able to perform most of the work that we are currently performing. So I think those two are at the top of my list when I look at our readiness to transition to the new normal.
If we look at the various dimensions, would you agree that the globe would not experience the impact equally? For demographics, for instance, if we look at Africa, we have high unemployment rate and the largest youth demographic in the world. How are we then to weather the storm, especially if we're really to zero in on who is most at risk?
So you're absolutely correct. We are not at the same level as the developed countries. However, I think there's a lot of opportunities that we have as a country to try and explore to make sure that we reduce the impact, especially when you look at our rate of unemployment. I think the e-commerce sector is largely, underexplored, and we should be looking at those opportunities to say, how do we get our services to rural areas, for example? How do we get, groceries to townships, where you would find that a lot of the online shopping that we see is still only happening in suburban areas. These are opportunities for new jobs to be created in terms of people making sure that we get these services through to the areas where previously they've been neglected and underdeveloped. So I think we need to stop looking at big fancy jobs and thinking that's where growth is going to come from. Of course, those are opportunities that we should look at. But if we look at what COVID has presented for us in terms of challenges, we need people to stay away from city centers, for example. But how are people expected to get all of these services that they need if we cannot deliver anything to the rural areas or to the townships? So, exploring e-commerce and all of the online services, I think there's a huge opportunity in that sector. A lot of people have been seeing in other countries the use of drones, for example, to make sure that services and products get to remote areas. And I think these are some of the avenues we should be looking at as a country to make sure that people that don't necessarily have the skills for some of the professional jobs that we are going to see disappearing are gainfully employed in making sure that we're delivering services and products to otherwise neglected sectors of our communities.
I want to talk about the uniqueness of the informal sector. The extent of the pay cuts and the layoffs are difficult to quantify at the moment, but at least we're getting a sense within the larger business sector. But what about the informal sector? It being wholly unorganized to begin with, and we're not even sure who is part of it.
So again, this is another challenge probably for our government to introduce some measures in the informal sector to make sure that people are benefiting from some of the measures that the government has put in place. If you look at the informal sector and the fact that it is not organized, it is not regulated, it means those people are actually excluded from the measures like, for example, the temporary employer relief scheme that the government has recently launched. So I think this is an opportunity to make sure that institutions like the Department of Labor and Employment start becoming a little bit more active in the informal sector, seeing how we can actually organize and regulate the sector so that we know who is in the sector. And when we are faced with such challenges, we can actually make sure that everybody benefits. Because right now, the people that are going to benefit from this temporary employer relief scheme are people who are currently employed and people where, the employers have obviously been complying with the UIF regulations. But we have a huge population that is in the informal sector where if people are not able to go to the city center, those people are, severely affected. So I think this is quite a huge challenge for government at this stage to make sure that we start setting up some sort of a scheme for the protection of the people that are in the informal sector. And this doesn't just apply to people that sell on the street, for example. I see a lot of people in the arts and culture who are severely affected at this point. And I think we have a huge challenge and a lot of work to do there, making sure that those people in those sectors also benefit from some sort of a social security system that can help them alleviate some of the challenges that they are currently facing.
Building smarter solutions for those who are at least trying to modify their business so that when they continue to employ those that they do or are able to, what should some of these businesses focus on? There are protections that government is trying to build in place, but they're not enough. And we know that there are some companies that are also flighting regulations. How do we help the employee in this case?
So this has been a huge concern, Tsepi. So we've seen cases of organizations who have not been complying with government regulations in terms of how you are supposed to handle layoffs during this period. I think what is important to stress is that the rules are still there and employees still need to be protected. And I'm happy that I saw that I think the CCMA is now open, and I think we should be putting a lot more focus and emphasis on making sure that CCMA services are reaching people, particularly in vulnerable communities, in the rural areas and small towns, so that people are not exploited during this time. Of course, organizations should, at the first, as a first step, not exploit people, follow the regulations, consult, explain to people what is happening from a business challenge perspective. So the rules are still there to be followed. However, I think we can support employees by making sure, or we can support workers by making sure that all of this information is available to them. The biggest challenge right now, from what I've been hearing, is that people are unable to communicate with the Department of Labor and Employment, because the offices are obviously closed, but there's also just a bit of a challenge in getting through to the offices when people have these complaints. So I think we should look at which other government offices are available in these remote areas that people can call into or go into when they are being exploited, because this is a serious concern, particularly in sectors like agriculture. I've heard a lot of that from people that I talk to. Obviously, hospitality, which is heavily affected, but the rules are still there. So consultations still need to happen, and I think employers should not hide behind the fact that they cannot have people coming into the office or into the workplace for consultation. There are many other avenues that we can employ to make sure that we are still communicating with people, letting them know the kind of challenges that the businesses are facing.
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Cebile Xulu is an HR expert and people lead of Sahara Africa, Mondelez International. Of course, later on we'll be looking at the kind of reform process that the government should be pursuing for the economy. And if you are a business owner, or perhaps you are an entrepreneur or somebody who wants to reskill themselves to see how you can find opportunities, we'll be talking in depth about that in the next hour. Now let's take a look